Hello. This is the reading of Chapter 7 of Life, Death, and In Between by SaturdayNightFrights and read by Paultyr. This is a Danny Phantom and DCU crossover. And so, without further ado, please enjoy the fic. Chapter 7. Reasonably Warm. And I'm here to say that time does heal things up. All things, I reckon. But some things leave behind dreadful, ugly scars. Allie Ray, Holler. All Dick could think was, what in the fuck just occurred in my life? He stared at Danny, resting his head in his hand as he watched the teen sleep for the first time in days, watched the hitching rise and fall of his chest. It was like the kid had trouble breathing. Dick rubbed at his jaw, looking back at his laptop and the case files displayed on the screen, eyes scanning the words without really reading them. His gaze kept turning to the boy's still figure, asleep in his bedroom with the door wide open, for Dick's peace of mind. Scrubbing at his eyes, Dick leaned back in the armchair. The situation with the kid had become weirder and weirder from the moment Dick had received that call from Gordon 5 days ago. In the past 24 hours, the weirdness had nearly peaked. Not only had he acquired a maybe clone of his youngest brother, said kid also had some truly impressive skills. For one, he was quiet. Almost abnormally so. If not for the fact that Dick had expected near thoughts from the maybe clone assassin, Danny was sneaky too, making several attempts to escape without Dick's notice. The kid hadn't succeeded, of course, just managed to raise Dick's paranoia, which, to be fair, was an impressive feat in and of itself. He had managed to escape under the watch of Artemis and Wally, slipping past not one, but 2 trained superheroes without arousing suspicion. Wally had grumbled that it was as if the kid could walk through walls. Dick had asked the pair to watch the kid for 2 reasons. The first being that Nightwing needed to make an appearance after almost a week of absence. The second, he needed an objective view on the kid. Despite himself, Dick was getting attached. Danny reminded him of both Jason and Damien, making Dick feel soft in the boy. That wouldn't do. So, he'd asked his best friends for an extra pair of eyes, the first people he'd informed about the situation. Wally had been unnerved by Danny, said something felt off and uneasy about the kid. Artemis had no such reservations. According to her, he was just a normal kid, too skittish for his own good, but normal. Then the kid had shown up on the roof of the building and clocked Dick as being Nightwing within seconds. Decidedly not normal, non-normal, unnormal, abnormal. Heavy on the ab? Then, that night, Dick had walked in and seen 2 red lines against 2 white skin. Danny's icy blue eyes staring at him, wide and unblinking in terror. Danny should not be alive, that was certain. The autopsy, and that's what it was, wasn't it? An autopsy incision, a Y-shaped cut done to the dead to prove their organs was imprinted on the flesh of a living child. Incision was not just irritated, it was actively decaying. The edges of his flesh had turned black with rot, peeling away from the incision to reveal the bloody, infected mess of Danny's abdominal muscles. The red lines of blood poisoning had raced up and down his sides, interrupted only by the bloom of blackened bruises. Danny should resolutely not be alive. He'd had to cut away the flesh, strip the blackened, dead, and diseased parts away from the boy, cutting down until he hit living tissue, then flushing the exposed muscles and tendons through the festering pus that oozed there, closing the child up with bandages instead of the intensive care he needed. Danny had not cried. Dick could not apologize enough. Dick blinked away the memory, his grip tightening on his laptop. He had wanted to take Danny to the hospital. He had almost grabbed the boy and ran with him to Gotham General. Danny's protest be damned, but he couldn't. Danny had looked up at him with wide, pleading, terrified eyes, and Dick couldn't do it. Every fiber of his being screamed out in protest to his thoughts, had demanded that Dick stop and listen to Danny, to do as the boy wanted rather than as he needed. He'd felt compelled to obey. So he'd gathered all the medical knowledge he'd possessed and done his best, wishing that it had been Alfred's or Dr. Tompkins' hands, holding an antiseptic rather than his own. Dick was not squeamish by any means, and had long grown accustomed to blood being on his hands, yet with Danny, it was different. He had almost felt the boy's pain as if it were his own, had wanted to wrap him up tightly in his arms and take on the pain so that Danny wouldn't suffer. His heart broke when he realized how long the boy had been hiding his injuries for them to deteriorate to such a degree. If he was correct on his original belief that Danny was a clone of Damien, then resurrection was not entirely impossible. Probable, actually, given the League's tendencies. Resurrection after an autopsy would explain the wounds. Jason's scars across his body from when he was pierced together proved that the pit did not erase everything. Only the wounds were too fresh, bloody and oozing, red lines drawn across Danny's pale skin like a child's coloring book. The kid was beyond requiring hospitalization from blood poisoning. He was lucky that Dick didn't need to call in for funeral services. Yet. Not to mention the rattling coughs that had resulted in spots of red that made Dick believe Danny was also fighting an infection in his lungs. He couldn't clean the wounds good enough, couldn't find the safe house stock of antibiotics quick enough. For Danny to have such fresh wounds, the only answer was vivisection rather than dissection. Not an autopsy, then. Someone had done this to Danny while he was alive. Dick felt bile in the back of his throat at the thought, followed quickly by a searing rage that painted his vision in swaths of green for a millisecond. He would kill whoever did this. Clones were nothing new to him, nothing new to any vigilante or superhero for that matter. It was a sad fact that he'd come to realize. Clones were not often viewed as people, seen as poor imitations of the originals rather than their own separate beings. Superman's first clones, Match and Connor, proved how they were experiments and test subjects at their best to their creators. As upsetting as it was, Danny would make sense in the context of being a clone, except that he didn't. Damian Wayne had no reason to be cloned by any major facility within the continental U.S. as far as the public was concerned. Damian was the youngest child of Brucey Wayne. No reason to pry further into him. Damian Al Ghul Wayne, however, had often been cloned by his mother and grandfather in various schemes to regain their perfect heir. If Danny was Damian's clone, then Talia would have been the culprit. Dick watched as Danny shifted slightly in his sleep. He placed his laptop on the coffee table and silently walked into the kid's room to check on him. Even in the dark of the room, Dick could see Danny's face pinched in pain as he slept. The man frowned down at him, lightly pressing 2 fingers to Danny's cheek, feeling that the boy was clammy and slightly warm. Dick went into the ensuite to prepare a cool, damp cloth for the boy. No, Danny could not have been a clone created by Talia for one simple reason. For all of her faults, Talia would never have allowed any incarnation of her son to be subjected to experimentation. He wrung the excess water from the washcloth. Returning to Danny's side, Dick laid it carefully across the boy's brow. Hazy blue eyes cracked open to peer tiredly at him before fluttering shut as Danny returned to sleep. Giving one last glance at the boy, Dick returned to his position in the armchair, resigning himself to another sleepless night. One question plagued his mind, a question that, in truth, he really hadn't wanted to entertain. If Talia had concealed one child from Bruce, could she have hidden 2? Danny fidgeted under Dick's ministrations. The man had insisted upon refreshing his bandages after Danny had eaten breakfast and downed some antibiotics. He had sheepishly agreed. After all, nothing could be as bad as the night before. Still, Danny felt odd with his wounds being properly treated. Dick was nothing if not gentle, pausing when Danny flinched and asking if he was okay. The man's hands were cool against Danny's heated skin, feeling like a soothing balm, filling in the cracks that Danny hadn't realized had sprung up. It was nice. Dark blue eyes stared Danny down. "If you keep fidgeting like this, I'm going to duct tape you to the chair," Dick said. Danny paused and squinted at the man. "You wouldn't do that." He snorted, lips quirking up slightly at the corners, amused at Danny's apparent concern. "No, probably not to you, but you do seriously need to stop fidgeting," Dick said. Danny chewed his lip and offered a slight shrug, causing Dick to give him a deadpan look as his movement disrupted his process. "Sorry, I'm not used to someone else doctoring me up," Danny said, trying to force himself to stay still. The man nodded, reapplying the sticker-like sutures. Dick frowned, taking in Danny's words. He continued his work, nonchalantly asking Danny a question. How do you take care of this anyways?" "Stapler." Dick paused and looked up at Danny, confusion plastered across his face. "A stapler? Where'd you get your hands on a medical stapler?" Danny's eyebrows furrowed. A small frown pulled at his lips. "Medical stapler. Were all staplers not basically the same? They stapled things. What else mattered?" "Medical stapler? It was just a stapler." Like the ones used for school? He said, cheeks burning as Dick's expression morphed into a cross between horror, awe, and exasperation. Dick closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Are you telling me you're held together by office supplies? Yes? The rest of the morning was filled by awkwardness as Dick stiffly patched Danny up, grumbling to himself on the incredulousness of teenagers. Somehow, Danny felt like Dick was being hypocritical, although he couldn't exactly put his finger on why. There was a tension in the air between the two, exacerbated by all the unsaid things, the secrets they both knew the other was hiding. Danny was not so hopeful as to believe that Dick would just drop the matter of his vivisection wound, while the man seemed, at least for the moment, more concerned with Danny's healing and keeping the wound clean. Eventually, he would start to ask questions that Danny wasn't so sure he was ready to answer, even if he felt that the man deserved to know the truth. Finding out that Dick Grayson was the hero Nightwing had done wonders for his trust in the man. Even so, Danny was not so naive to think that Dick had been entirely forthcoming about their situation. As grateful as Danny was, there was simply no way that a case of mistaken identity was enough for Vigilante to keep Danny under his guardianship. Worry about what other aspects were at play that had started to churn in his stomach the moment Dick had confirmed that he was Nightwing, growing with each second that Danny was left to stew in his own thoughts in the matter. It didn't help that Dick had been slightly agitated for nearly the whole day, pacing and running his hand through his hair in displays of anxious energy. His phone would beep at random intervals, and each message seemed to push the man further into frustration. Several times he glanced up at Danny, frowned, and shook his head as he returned to tapping away at his phone. Whoever was on the other end was obviously annoying Dick. Danny leaned his head against the cool glass of the large living room window, looking down at the people hurrying about like ants in the street below. The late afternoon sun had not had a chance to shine down upon the Gothamites before it was covered by ominously dark clouds. Surely there had to be some weather-manipulating villain at work in Gotham. The near constant cover of rain could only work of some gloomy meta. Maybe Batman was the cause. Certainly the damp and gloom had aided in his nighttime activities. Danny would have to ask Dick if Batman secretly controlled the weather of Gotham. Danny snorted at the thought, watching as the first few drops of rain trailed down the glass. Dick clapped his hands together, startling Danny. "All right," he said, a forced grin on his face. "How about we head out for a bit? Maybe check out the library?" His dark blue eyes seemed pinched at the edges, with a look that screamed he hoped Danny would decline, but needed him to say yes. Danny narrowed his eyes in suspicion. "Why?" For books. To read? Do you read?" Danny made a face and shrugged one shoulder. "Not really. I mean, I never really have time to," he said. "Never late to start. Let's go," Dick said, turning abruptly to grab his keys. In the 45 minutes it took for the pair to get ready and drive to the Gotham Public Library, pausing halfway due to traffic, Danny noted that Dick did not receive a single notification. It had been a few weeks since Danny had first set foot in the Gotham Public Library. He thought that his situation had mildly improved just from then. He turned in a slow circle once they reached the center of the building, taking in the art ceiling and rows of books. Danny hadn't read much in the past year, much to his English teacher's chagrin, yet there had been a time when he'd found solace in books, used them as an escape and a way to transition into a society with a different culture and language than the one he was born into. Danny's gaze landed on Dick. The man was leaning against the counter next to the rather pretty librarian. He had been quiet the entire ride over, very obviously trailed by something and caught up in his own thoughts, only offering up that they needed to get out sometimes, and that Danny didn't need to worry about a library card. He gave Danny a small grin and made a shooing gesture with his hand, obviously expecting Danny to go off in his own for a bit. There was something unexpectedly nice that Dick seemed to trust that Danny wasn't going to run away. He was right, of course. Danny wasn't inclined to run off. Not now, at least. As Dick turned to speak with the librarian, Danny wandered off into the bookstacks. There was a pounding ache behind his ribs, a hunger in the space just out of reach. A different kind of hunger than the one Danny had been expecting, the one he'd have to feed first. The spectral hunger that seemed to have dissipated as of late. Danny had been mostly concerned with his health and healing of his mortal half, neglecting his spectral side. His reasoning was that, well, that side couldn't die again, Horribly mangled as he was, he couldn't even shift into his other form. His mortal side had just seemed more pressing, more deserving of immediate attention. Now, Danny thought he should try and ease the ache of his wounded core by feeding into his obsessions. A library was bound to have books on space after all, right? He wandered up the metal stairs in the second floor, walking further and further away from Dick until he couldn't see the man anymore. Couldn't see anyone, for that matter. Only long lines of books, shelves reaching toward the ceiling and arranged in a dizzying maze. The smell of paper and the sound of soft whispers in the air. Danny loved it. A small smile played on his lips as he lightly trailed his fingers across the glossy, laminated book spines. Numbers and letters printed on small white strips. Danny had no idea how to use the Dewey Decimal System, but browsing the stacks was much more fun anyways. When was the last time he'd had this kind of normalcy, been aimless in a library of any kind? Memories of moments with Sam and Tucker came to mind, flashes of laughter when they were together, frustration at school projects. He'd miss them terribly, even Miss Lancer and his ridiculous projects and expectations. Distantly, Danny wondered if he would ever return to school. He hummed at the thought, reaching his intended destination. Danny pushed his troubling thoughts aside in favor of indulging in the pure joy that began to bubble up. From the shelves he pulled out a book on the Hubble Space Telescope. Eagerly, Danny started to flip through the pages, pausing at a particularly beautiful pictures. This one would do. He snapped the book closed and looked back to the shelves, feeling good. A grin was slowly making its way across his face as he reached up for another tile that looked promising, rising up on his tiptoes to try and ease the strain on his torso. Movement in the corner of his eyes momentarily caught Danny's attention. His head snapped up, blue eyes searching the aisle for what he'd seen. Only Danny was still alone in the aisle, just him and the rows of books. Danny's smile faded. Surely it was just another patron walking past. Nothing more. He took a steadying breath and looked down at the book in his hands, flipping it to read the back. It was about the stars. Danny's favorite part about space, about constellations and how they related to civilizations of the past. Another promising book Danny was definitely going to ask Dick to check out for him. More movement at the end of the aisle had Danny pausing. He glanced up through his eyelashes to see who or what was in the aisle with him. He froze, stomach churning as his heart started to beat faster. Danny could barely focus over the steadily increasing roar of blood in his ears. At the end of the aisle was a man in a starchy white coat. Hello. I'd just like to say thank you for listening to the end of the video. I really do appreciate it. Wow, hiatus, crazy. I know. I had exams, always on those, and for the year overall, by the way. What can I say? I'm just that amazingly amazing. I also went on vacation, big London, cool place. Though I am glad to be back. Anyways, if you enjoyed the podfic, you can leave me a like, maybe subscribe. Also, if you have requests or a fic you'd like me to read, please leave a comment to let me know. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed. Until next time, this is Poltergeist, signing off.